here at the Central Library. I want to welcome you all to today's program, The Legacy and Leadership of Howard W. Coles by Dr. Anthony Siracusa and Chris Thom. Before we get started, I want to inform everyone that restrooms are located to the left of the auditorium, so hang a left as you head out the back door. Also, before we get to today's presentation, I'd like to briefly mention a couple upcoming local history programs. Next Saturday, February 21st at 1 p.m., the Rochester Jamaican Organization will be holding a program celebrating the rich history and culture of Jamaica in the Custer Cox Auditorium across the street on the 3rd floor. And on Saturday, March 7th at 1 p.m., Gregory Zeiner will be here in the Kate Gleason Auditorium to discuss the history of the East Main Culver Winton neighborhood. There are flyers for these programs at the table in the back for anyone who's interested. And now for today's program. We're joined here today by Dr. Anthony Siracusa and Chris Thom. Dr. Siracusa is Assistant Professor of History and Community Engagement at St. John Fisher University. Mr. Thom is a recent history graduate from St. John Fisher, whose research is focused on Rochester in the 20th century. Today they're here to talk to us about the fascinating research they've undertaken into Howard Coles' local activist endeavors. This research was made possible through a Supporting Historical Assets grant funded by the Lloyd E. Kloss Fund and the Plum Miller Fund of the Rochester Area Community Foundation. Without any further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Siracusa and Chris Thom.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks everybody for taking time on your Saturday to be here. Delighted to see some familiar faces, and wonderful to see some new faces. Howard Wilson Coles was among Rochester's most important civic leaders, black or white, in this city's long and storied history. Yes, we mean that. A simple biographical sketch can tell us some things about him. Who was Howard Coles, though? He was born on November 12, 1903 in Valcoda, New York. His family had come to the Rochester area from Culpeper, Virginia in the 1880s. He was one of two sons, born to Charles and Grace Coles. He grew up in Mumford, New York, right down the road. He traveled throughout the Northeast, working to earn wages as a hotel bellboy and a waiter in the 1920s, before returning to Rochester in the early 1930s, where he settled for the remainder of his life. In 1933, Howard Coles borrowed $2,800 from his life insurance policy, and with the help of Elsie Scott Kilpatrick, founded the Voice newspaper. Coles published and distributed this newspaper from 1933 through 1996, later with the help of his daughter, Joan Coles Howard. And at its apex, this newspaper reached approximately 10,000 copies. But a biographical sketch really tells us only so much. Coles was many things, but a truth teller and journalist would have to be near the top of the list. Coles consistently shone a light on both the challenges and the successes of the black community. His mission was to carry forward the legacy of Frederick Douglass, who published the North Star newspaper in this city for 25 years. Coles was among the first in Rochester to tell the story of Rochester's oldest African-American citizens, Austin Stewart, Thomas James, in his book, The Cradle of Freedom, published in 1944 by Oxford University Press. He, of course, also told the story of his hero, Frederick Douglass. Coles published a black business directory in 1939, highlighting every black enterprise in town, as well as counting all the different black professions and exactly how many individuals were in those professions. He published a housing survey of the black community that same year, literally counting the plumbing problems, the heating issues, the mold concerns, and any other related issues afflicting the homes of African-American people right here in Rochester. In 1938, he became the first black personality on Rochester radio when he debuted on WSAY radio. Coles also wrote two books that have yet to be published, The Negro Family in Rochester and Nomads of the South, which he intended to be follow-up addendums to his Cradle of Freedom work to tell a full, detailed story about the black community right here in Rochester. Coles also, believe it or not, continued his work in intrepid ways in different areas by becoming a real estate agent, assisting potential black homeowners in achieving the American dream through home ownership, a critically important occupation here in Rochester, where with a history of redlining, restrictive covenants, and restricted access to housing. In all of his work, Coles was willing to put forth his greatest efforts in hopes of uplifting the community. His contributions were far-reaching, they came over a sustained period, 4 to 5 decades, and they demonstrate a lifelong commitment to organizing and activism. Coles was a fact finder of the highest order. As Chris and I have gone through his papers and done this research, that really stands out as being among Coles's number one commitments: finding the facts, telling the truth. He was deeply involved in many local organizations, including the local NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and FIGHT, Freedom, Integrity, God, Honor Today, the organization that grew out of the 1964 Rochester Rebellion. And he also founded organizations like the Frederick Douglass Nonviolent League. He helped the city plan a housing project for veterans. He organized direct action campaigns. He had ambitious plans to use churches as education and daycare centers, to open health clinics. He covered and supported black migrants who were traveling from the South and calling Rochester home over a period of decades. And in the years before the 1964 rebellion, called a race riot at the time, he was ahead of the curve. Coles predicted that such an uprising could occur here, and he frequently printed warnings in The Voice about the problems that lay at the heart of the Rochester Rebellion. Coles battled employment discrimination, a key reason for the 1964 rebellion, consistently meeting with management at RG&E, the Rochester Gas and Electric Company, to advocate for more black employees. Coles's contributions as a journalist, an activist, a historian, a radio personality, as an organizer, as a real estate agent, in addition to being a husband and father, were far-reaching. He cared deeply about this place, Rochester, and dedicated his life to making this city a better place for all people. To date, that legacy has not been properly chronicled. I was talking with an individual here, Vic, before we started, and there's essentially one, maybe two things you can read online about Howard Coles today. Almost nothing has been published about him. Our research, supported by the Community Foundation of Rochester over the last year, is attempting to begin to rectify that issue. We hope to fill a notable gap both in our historical memory and in the scholarly record about the contributions of Howard Coles. It is impossible in our presentation today to cover the full sweep of Coles' contributions, so we're going to focus on the following topics. Coles's work with the Rochester NAACP from the 1940s through the 1970s. His work founding and running the Frederick Douglass League Nonviolence Committee. His work with FIGHT in the 1960s, and his remarkable and successful work to reshape urban renewal in the 3rd Ward and save Memorial AME Zion Church, which, not to bury the lead here or spoil the ending, he did almost single-handedly. Without further ado, let's get into some of his earliest work, starting with the NAACP in the 1940s. The Rochester NAACP was actually chartered in 1919, roughly a decade after black and white people came together to found this national organization dedicated to the advancement of civil rights for black people. Despite this history spanning over a century, it can be hard to find clear examples of sustained and effective campaigns by the Rochester NAACP. The chapter experienced several periods of dormancy, but it never faded entirely and even remains active at the time of this presentation. Howard Coles and his wife Alma frequently criticized the local NAACP chapter in the early 1940s for its shortcomings. They both largely supported the national NAACP's mission, but they felt right here in Rochester that there was an inconsistent focus on the most important issues that were affecting the black community. And Coles, as you'll see throughout this presentation, was willing to speak his mind whether it was popular or not. In the June 29th, 1943 edition of The Voice, his newspaper, his wife, Alma Coles, cited the dysfunction of the local NAACP chapter, and she put her husband in the running for the president of the local chapter. Alma Coles argued that the local chapter was more concerned with maintaining political alliances than achieving its high purpose. She argued, quote, "It has failed consistently in its high purpose because it has been run by a few persons so deficient in insight, so hampered by binding alliances, that they have permitted its true ideals to become almost completely befogged by insincerity," end quote. Regardless of the reasons, Alma Coles made clear with several examples that instances of discrimination against the black community were going unchecked by the local chapter in the 1940s. First, she talked about instances where black people of, quote, good family and sufficient means, end quote, were denied the ability to purchase a home as it might anger their neighbors. Alma noted that, quote, the national office of this organization is constantly on alert for such discriminatory acts as this and fights to the last ditch, end quotes. The Rochester branch, on the other hand, is, quote, so filled with persons afraid of stepping on someone's toes that even when such instances are brought to their attention, they are consistently tabled, presumably for further discussions which are never allowed to take place, end quote. This critique came amid the routine practice in Rochester and across the country of crafting and enforcing racially restrictive covenants. Eastman Savings and Loan, as one example, included racially restrictive covenants in the deeds of homes it financed as a matter of policy. Just as an aside, I was talking to a friend here in town who lives in Irondequoit today, and she told me that she found her deed for her home, and it says on there, this home can never be bought, sold, or rented to Negroes. So we know this was a common practice. In the 1940s, it was continuing, and the local NAACP was doing very little, according to Alma Coles and Howard. She also pointed to another instance in 1944 where a black man was denied entrance to a local theater. Coles was especially incensed about this because the individual facing discrimination was an enlisted soldier, a sailor on leave. We know from a variety of examples that the Second World War really became the tip of the spear for the budding freedom movement that would explode in the 1950s and 1960s, in part because black soldiers fighting fascism abroad came home to find instances of discrimination routine. In a 1944 article in The Voice, Alma Coles continued her critique of the NAACP leadership for demanding more cooperation from the black community when they had done nothing to earn it. She said the local chapter had failed to organize local people, writing, quote, the president declared that he was intending to demand more cooperation, otherwise he would be forced to give up the work. What work? End quote. Alma Coles once again brought up the case of discrimination at the theater, noting the NAACP's inaction, and pointed to the migrant camps on the shore of Lake Ontario, which had scores of black workers living in abysmal living conditions. The NAACP was silent on all of these issues, according to Alma Coles, and such inaction was shrinking the chapter and its membership. One thing I'll note here again as another aside is Howard Coles focused intently on the black migrants coming from the South during the Great Migration. This really occurred in great numbers in the 1940s, but especially in the 1950s, so that the black population at 1900 was around 600 individuals. By 1970, you have close to 65,000 African-American people living here. The vast majority of those people came here in the 1950s. But what Alma Coles is referring to are often agricultural workers who would migrate here from the South and decided this is a little bit better than what's going on down South. So they went from being migrants to stagrants. Howard Coles often, as you can see here in his newspaper, would chronicle the conditions that they would face, especially those who were living in those temporary camps. Alma Coles spent a lot of time critiquing the NAACP, and it's amazing to see her leadership alongside her husband, Howard, in the 40s. Her ire for the new leadership was balanced by hope that this local chapter might live up to its lofty aims. But what she called for was a change in leadership and a change right away. Quote, it is the considered opinion of more than a few persons that it might just be as well if said if the president quit right now for all the good he's doing. It is not necessarily implied that the intentions of the NAACP are not good, but it is a well-known adage that the road to a very hot place is paved with good intentions. It is time the NAACP realized that the solution of a great many problems begins, like charity, at home, as one man pointed out at a recent meeting, end quote. This sentiment summarizes well the position of both Howard and Alma Coles in terms of how they saw the Rochester NAACP in the 1940s. The local branch was failing to live up to its principles. Their intention in critiquing the organization was to demand better from a group whose mission they held in high regard. The NAACP was without parallel as a civil rights organization with a track record of fighting for African Americans during this time period, and both Alma and Howard Coles recognized this. In the decades before the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, the NAACP was often among the few, and very often, the only organized group willing to stand up and fight for African Americans. So it was especially important to both Howard and Alma Coles that during this time, the NAACP step up and live its charter. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and researcher, Chris Thom, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the continued work of Howard and Alma Coles with the NAACP.
Thank you, Dr. Siracusa, and hello, everybody. Continuing the discussion on the NAACP. In the Coles Archive, there was very little discussion about the NAACP's work throughout the 1950s. However, once the 60s starts up, Coles felt that the local NAACP was consistently missing opportunities, and he became fed up with their leaders' willingness to settle for token progress. At this point in time, the local chapter president was Quentin Primo, and he rejected the chance to attack structural racism, and he was intent on pursuing progress in a way that did not impede on the white power structure. According to the historian Laura Hill, quote, "Father Primo took great pride in his ability to engage his community in unique and unexpected ways and to make coalitions with civic groups," end quote. But she also noted that, quote, "These alliances undoubtedly assisted Primo in his 1959 bid for the presidency of the Rochester NAACP," end quote. Now, Coles, for his part, was not concerned with these alliances. Of course, he wanted to push through despite any alliances Primo might have. He was not worried about stepping on toes. He was really worried about making a change in his community. And this discrepancy really becomes apparent with the Chatham Gardens controversy. When the new federally funded housing project known as Chatham Gardens was proposed for construction, the Rochester City Council created a committee to oversee the project, and they placed Quentin Primo on this committee to speak for the black community. The issue came about when the City Council made the decision to build the housing in just one neighborhood, and this was preferable for the white residents who could then avoid the possibility of integration through the building of subsidized housing if they could choose to, only keep it in one specific area or neighborhood. A council member found that they were in unanimity of opposition to the housing being built in white neighborhoods. So the white leaders and the white city leaders were not in support of building outside of areas that were predominantly black, which struck a chord with the younger leaders of the NAACP. So some of these local supporters of the NAACP, including Coles, opposed the council's approach. And eventually this debate would continue, and this debate would continue, and then a new political league was established. Glenn Clater, Walter Cooper, and many other young, energetic black activists formed the Monroe County Nonpartisan Political League. And this league immediately got to work criticizing the NAACP's inaction and the decision of the City Council. So they published a statement that was prepared on March 27th, 1962 in The Voice, and by doing so they were able to publish their unfiltered reservations about the project. And of course, as I said, one of the main issues was with the location. They wanted to build, quote, "in the heart of a designated slum area and a designated ghetto, next door to low-cost public housing projects in an over-congested area," end quote. The public facilities in this area were horrifically lacking, and the only school that served the entire neighborhood was already under-equipped for the students that it had. So on number 3 of the slide, or on number 3 up here, you can see they make a really strong criticism that really represents the issue they had. It says, quote, "It must have broad representation of responsible Negroes on the policymaking board, not just Negroes, but responsible Negroes with imagination and integrity who do not sell out the masses for segregated housing." So I think this statement from the league really does a good job of selling up their main issue, which was that they felt that Quentin Primo and some of the other conservative black leaders had kind of sold out the community, and they weren't willing to take the aggressive steps that the community was asking for. And most of his efforts as a leader in the 60s, however, were not spent criticizing the NAACP, but they were focused on the Frederick Douglass League's Nonviolent Committee. Coles describes this as a local autonomous civil rights group that was founded in February of 1899 by Frederick Douglass. And of course, he really took a lot of care and effort in preserving Frederick Douglass's legacy, so this organization was very important to him. Coles led this organization, and he attempted to address many of Rochester's most critical issues regarding the black community. He organized picket campaigns, and he promoted fundraisers in Rochester from 1960 to 1963, in a time before the uprising had taken place. So there was not nearly as many people organizing at this time, or compared to in the future after the uprising. Yet Coles was still on the ground and doing all the work that he could. And eventually, the goals and methods of the programs Coles developed would turn out to be very similar to what would come later with Fight and Action for a Better Community, which just shows his prescience and how ahead of his time he was in understanding these issues. So his greatest effort through the Frederick Douglass League Nonviolent Committee was his project called Operation Grassroots. And this was a really ambitious attempt to foster community organization at the grassroots level. And Coles was hoping to secure some government funding in order to bring this to reality. So his primary objective was to ease the plight of Rochester's incoming migrants, which were making up the majority of the black population. He sought to help them in areas of housing, employment, education, and religious affiliation. And he really had a very extensive plan, as you can see in the chart. Coles aimed to establish a coordinating center, which would be used to contact city, county, and state agencies. And then they also planned to use 2 churches as daycare centers throughout the week, and they would also use these churches as adult education centers 2 nights a week. Coles planned on using the AME Zion on the west side of the city and the Church of Jesus Christ on the east. This was because at this time the black community was divided into 2 small communities on the separate sides of the city, so Coles knew that the most effective solution would be to go to these people where they already are, rather than only putting, one building in place and then saying, they have to go to them. So that was I think, a very clever way to address that issue. And there they would teach people how to read. As Coles said, that illiteracy was very high and that people would feel more comfortable learning in their church rather than in a school setting. And he also planned on opening 2 health clinics that would run all week on each side of the city. And according to a memo from Coles, we do know that he, in fact, was able to get the daycare centers up in staff by 1966. So another thing he did with the Frederick Douglass Nonviolent League Committee was he organized protests to try to end discrimination in hiring. So these plans, again, reflect Coles' continuous focus on helping black migrants, as well as his deep understanding of the city's issues. Now, Coles explained that most of the migrants were seasonal workers who ended up becoming unemployed 5 months of the year because there was not, the jobs in Rochester they required specialized skills. So places like Kodak, Bausch and Lomb would not really accept unskilled workers. So they would be out of a job for many months of the year, and they would have to use unemployment insurance. And Coles explained that basically this was keeping them in poverty. Only being able to work so many months of the year, it's very hard for anyone to earn a living. So he wanted to address that by opening up more permanent jobs. So the League's Nonviolent Committee launched several initiatives, and they worked on organizing picket lines downtown in order to protest against this. These formations were organized at South Ave and East Main every Saturday at 1 p.m. Additionally, they negotiated with business leaders from many occupations. They held negotiations with the Rochester Merchants Retail Association of the Chamber of Commerce, the Rochester Hotel and Motel Association, and the Rochester Retail Auto Dealers Association. So you can see they're pushing across the board basically to just go against any employers that are being discriminatory. And in addition, there was one instance where they were planning a boycott against Fannie Farmer Candy Company. First, they picketed the company, and then they entered negotiations. And on paper, Coles actually did get them to make some promises. They promised that they would hire factory workers, black factory workers, and then they promised to hire some black women to work at store counters. Now, Coles says that they did hire some black factory workers, but they went back on their promise to hire workers in the storefront. So So for this reason, Coles gave them a deadline of November 23rd, 1963 to hire the workers that they had promised, or else he would begin his boycott. But it's unclear if they actually met the deadline or if the boycott started. And then he also planned a lot of other projects throughout the city. One of them was called Operation Milk Lift. This project aimed to provide school numbers 3, 6, and 9 with cereal and hot food before school started. This project was a collaboration between some businessmen from the Joseph Avenue Business Association, volunteer women from the neighborhood, and black churches. So Coles also wrote of Operation Real Estate, which intended to secure more housing for more black people in suburban developments. And of course, Coles also did work as a real estate agent in order to further this end. Additionally, he said that he was going to try and break down the gentlemen's agreements or the restrictive covenants. Even after they were legislated against, they continued informally. So Coles wanted to try and break down these informal restrictive covenants. And in a consistent theme for Coles, he also called for deposing the old ineffective leadership and developing new leadership among the youth. In the memo, Coles emphasized, quote, the development of African American leadership among the youth of the community and the liquidation and elimination of Uncle Tom's, Safe Blacks, and the Kislings that are at the moment cluttering up the scene. So here you can see Coles is willing to use very strong language towards those older conservative leaders, and despite being an older guy himself, he was totally fed up with the status quo and was hoping that he could help develop this generation of young leaders that would really push for a change that the old leaders couldn't. And I think these projects, that's a picture of Coles, and I think these projects demonstrate a multifaceted approach to the issues of the time. The approach Coles took to activism, it transcended barriers of class, and his leadership demonstrated an understanding of what was needed to help not only professionals, but the working class or the poor and unemployed as well. He didn't tailor his approach to prioritize one specific class over another. And this led to him working with many different people on many different projects. He wanted to help black professionals escape housing discrimination, but he also wanted to do something simple like ensuring that children in the poorest neighborhoods would have hot food to eat before school. So, at the same time he was helping folks stuck in what was considered to be the ghetto, he was also trying to create upward mobility for black professionals at the same time. Sometimes he worked with southern migrants living in horrible working conditions, and then sometimes he worked with black and white professionals. So it just shows that he was always willing to embrace anyone and try to work with anybody in order to get the change that he felt needed to be made. And Coles also worked a lot within the organization Fight, which sprung up after the 1964 uprising. Essentially, after the younger generation of leaders challenged Quentin Primo's leadership, the uprising occurred. There was a power vacuum within the political structure of Rochester. Historian Laura Hill says, quote, black Rochesterians were now seeking alternate voices to represent their concerns and new organizational structures that would pursue their aspirations socially, politically, and economically, end quote. So in Rochester, there was a desire for a new sort of organization that would have more aggressive tactics. Now, Fight, for the background of the organization, they were created with help of famed Chicago activist Saul Alinsky and his Industrial Areas Foundation, which did a lot of work organizing the south side of Chicago. They were originally invited here by the Rochester Area Council of Churches. However, this was mostly a group of white ministers, so when they reached out to Alinsky, he told them, I can't come here on the invitation of white ministers, I need to hear it from the black community themselves. So he agreed to work with Rochester only under the condition that he was invited by the black community. And so after this, community leaders had a discussion, and they weren't exactly sure if they should embrace Alinsky or not. This culminated with Minister Florence Franklin and Constance Mitchell actually having a meeting with Malcolm X during one of his last visits to Rochester on February 16th of 1965. And Florence just asked him outright what he thought of Alinsky, and Malcolm X told him that he'd done a great job organizing in Chicago, and after this endorsement, the black community did invite the International Industrial Areas Foundation into Rochester ubiquitous community member and prolific activist named Mildred Johnson. And she started working to identify all the existing community groups, neighborhood organizations, and other things like that. And what she did was bring them all together so that they could form this new umbrella organization. So it wasn't made up of just individuals, but it was a collection of already existing community organizations. And they decided that they would name themselves FIGHT, which stood for Freedom, Integration, God, Honor, Today. And Coles found his way into FIGHT through the Frederick Douglass League, which was of course one of the community organizations that joined. And then in addition to that, he was listed as a member of the solicitation committee, which was probably given to him due to his experience in fundraising his own projects. And on top of that, he was listed as being in the Frederick Douglass Committee as well, because of course he put a great amount of effort toward preserving Douglass's legacy. And interestingly, Cole started a debate within FIGHT when, during a committee meeting, he suggested that one of his associates from the league, the Frederick Douglass League, Mr. Grossfield, should be the head of the Jobs Committee. This ended up causing a huge debate within FIGHT because Mr. Grossfield was actually a white man, and FIGHT was kind of unclear on whether or not white people were allowed to hold like a chairman position within the Constitution that they made. Because they had a Constitution and a set of rules that were explicitly listed. So when Coles made the suggestion, it kind of started an argument because FIGHT's policy, one of the meetings they said that FIGHT's policy is self-determining for black people across the board. This means dealing with the black leaders that the people elect, not the hired yes men or the rubber toms chosen by downtown people. So on FIGHT's end of it, they were looking for black self-determination, and they were willing to work with white people, but they didn't want their voices to be drowned out by white people as they had in the past with, say, the local NAACP. So ultimately, we can see that in this memo that was in the Coles collection, the FIGHT recommended that if white people really wanted to help out, the best thing that they could do was to form their own organization that would work with them in basically advocating. It would work with them in trying to come together and solve issues between black and white people in the community, but they wanted it to be a separate organization so that it wouldn't mess with their self-determination. And then later on, Coles was able to revive the NAACP. In 1972, July 13th, 1972 edition of The Voice, there was an article called Rochester Welcomes the NAACP, and it claimed that a local group of citizens have been working since 1971 to reactivate the local chapter. So it doesn't seem that the chapter disappeared entirely, but it seems at some point in the years after the rebellion, with the rise of all these new organizations in the community, the NAACP essentially became dormant, but Coles was able to revitalize it, and he became the president. So the first program that Coles launched as president of the NAACP was actually a journalism course hosted by RIT from 1972 to 1973, and it was provided to the underprivileged students of the area. Coles hoped to, quote, to take students from the age of 16 to 18 years who qualify as disadvantaged and in need of a job and provide them with learning experience and training both in class and on the job in the field of journalism and graphic arts, end quote. Coles wrote that the students would learn how to research, find facts, and be able to support them, and that they would become aware of the values news stories have to their community, and it clearly reflects Coles' own journalistic strengths and principles. So Coles really wanted to make sure that the existing issues were not overlooked, and also that the positive things happening were not forgotten about as well. In a preface explaining the purpose of the project, Coles wrote that there appears to be a great need today to tell the inner city story. So many things are happening within the area that never seem to be communicated properly to the residents and or general public. And without the press, Coles feared that the black community would lose their ability to advocate for themselves by bringing attention to problems, as well as lose their awareness and understanding of the issues and how the community is trying to solve them. So, Coles didn't want to see, people's morale drop or to see them become unaware of what was going on in their community. And for this reason, he wanted to train a generation of young journalists. So the program was structured so that students had classroom instruction from Wednesday to Friday, 3 to 5 p.m. And after this time in class, students would also have field work that would help them gain real, actual experience as journalists. For the final weeks of this class, students would be sent to the inner city in groups led by a coordinator, and they would find and report on their own stories. Interestingly, though, a major chunk of the budget of this project came in the form of financial support for the students. So Coles planned on giving them $2 an hour to study for 6 hours a week, and when you combined all the students, that added up to $10,800 over a period of 30 weeks. So this money could have come from the community or a grant from the government, but based on what was found in his archive, it's unclear where he produced the money to fund this, but nonetheless, it was a really impressive thing that Coles was able to, fund with this newly revived NAACP. And this was the largest effort the local NAACP had made in some time. And it gave Coles an opportunity to combine both of the concepts while providing knowledge that may help young people start a career or foster a love for journalism. Another NAACP project that he worked on was called as Black Impact. So this was basically a scholarship benefit, and he described it as designed to reach every individual in the immediate Rochester community and surrounding suburbs. We planned a variety of music, art, drama, dance, a fashion show, and a most fantastic baked food sale and a black art exhibition. In addition to this, he invited guest speakers from the most prominent community organizations like ABC, FIGHT, the Rochester Urban League, Model Cities. So, he saw this as not only an opportunity to celebrate black culture and to raise money for children, but he also saw it as an opportunity to get the community more acquainted with the organizations that were working to improve it. And then this is Coles in his later years, and at the point he was doing the Black Impact and everything, he was already 72 years old. But despite being this old, he was managing to run as the president of the NAACP, continue to publish The Voice, and as I said, he organized the Black Impact fundraiser and the RIT journalism workshop, the Third Ward Beat. So while he was certainly getting older, he was still capable and effective as a leader, and his leadership truly had a positive community impact. In a Spectrum News article, a student who participated in the Third Ward Beat program, named Wanda Ware, fondly recalled her time in the program and the lifelong impact that it had on her. She said that we were very proud to be working on this newspaper with him, and very proud to be under his tutelage because of his great skill. Quote. Wanda ended up pursuing a career as a paralegal, and she credited the summer of 1972 working with Coles for honing her writing and editing skills that would be important to her throughout the rest of her career. And I'd like to turn the presentation back to Dr. Siracusa. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. One of the great things about being a historian is that you can be an archive hound. You can go and find stuff that people haven't really looked at before. And it's amazing. You can see from the slides, right, that Chris spent some substantive time in the Coles archive, which is at RMSC. And what was really fun about this project was to be able to get into this archive that to date, basically no researchers have engaged with. So all the material that you're hearing about and everything that you're seeing today is information that came out of the archive that essentially has not been seen yet. Howard Coles was deeply involved during the urban renewal period here, specifically around saving Memorial AME Zion Church, the oldest African American congregation in Rochester, which in 2027 will celebrate 200 years of existence. Yes, that's what I was going to say. Deserves a little bit of a shout out. A side project we've been working on, hopefully we'll be able to come present, is we're writing the history of this congregation. My students at St. John Fisher University have been working on this for 2 years, and going into the fall we'll actually put together an exhibit documenting the church's history on the occasion of its 200-year anniversary, so stay tuned for that. Coles was deeply involved with the chaos of urban renewal and the trouble that it brought to the black community here. Urban renewal, as many of you may know, was the name of government policy that dealt with, quote, improving impoverished neighborhoods. Exactly. People often joked that urban renewal actually meant Negro removal. What happened in Rochester, and in many places across the country, is that historically black neighborhoods were demolished, and what followed in their wake was the displacement of black residents and an influx of white residents. Coles, of course, foresaw this, as he did many things presciently in his career. And in a December 1968 column called Crisis, which you can see here, Coles writes that the new housing being built as part of Rochester's urban renewal effort was simply too expensive for the majority of people seeking homes. He provides statistics and figures about urban renewal in Rochester, writing that, quote, between 1960 and 66, building permits for some 10,000 apartments were issued and more than 20,000 private homes were built. But the family-sized apartments almost all rented for more than $150 a month, and most of the homes sold for $20,000 plus. This puts them right out of reach of low and moderate income families. This is not tomorrow's tragedy, it's here now. For our housing shortage means that it's getting harder for youthful teachers, technicians, production workers, salespeople, young executives, and public service employees to live and work in Monroe County. It translates out to factories and stores built in locations other than metropolitan Rochester, empty classrooms, falling tax revenues, vacant jobs, end quote. Coles's criticism of urban renewal policy would continue after he took up a position on the 3rd Ward Urban Renewal Advisory Committee. Through this committee and through his own personal actions, Coles put a lot of effort into preserving the AME Zion Church, as well as opposing the 3rd Ward Preservation District, which was created by the city of Rochester with federal money. The AME Zion Church was a key historic location for the black community of Rochester. It was the place where Frederick Douglass first printed his newspaper, the North Star, in 1847. It was the site of one of the first Sabbath schools when Thomas James founded the church in 1827. It was the place where Susan B. Anthony gave one of her final public addresses. It has historically been a place where individuals seeking freedom on the Underground Railroad would hide in the pews. It was famed that there was a trap door underneath the pulpit at the Spring and Favor Street location to safely ferry folks who were seeking freedom down into the Genesee River and safely to freedom. One side note that Dan Brolin has put together in his book, his recent book on the Underground Railroad, is that even though Buffalo was a site where many escaping enslaved people were captured by slave catchers, it was proven that Rochester was a place where not a single African American person was apprehended and sent back down to slavery. And this was in part because of the so-called vigilance committees. So what they had was individuals who were patrolling the slave catchers. And they would ring bells and they would send signs, and they had a variety of signals that they would send. And of course, Douglass was here during that time period. Without tumbling down the rabbit hole, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, of course, changed everything and essentially made it possible that if simply you were black, you could be caught in any state in the Union and sent back down south to be enslaved. So the city of Rochester arrayed against that. Memorial AME Zion Church was a critical site in this process. Urban renewal was unsympathetic to churches, as it was to many different institutions. They didn't necessarily care about this historic legacy. And it's likely that without Cole's valiant efforts, this church, this historic location, would likely have been destroyed. But Cole successfully had the church registered as an official landmark. He petitioned government officials to make this happen, and the first evidence that we have of Cole's beginning to work on this was in his correspondence with Congressman Barber Conable. Conable wrote that he heard of Cole's efforts to protect AME Zion as the urban renewal plans were threatening it, and he said there was currently no legislation to protect the church, but he would propose a bill to make this possible. Later, on June 18th, a letter from the Rochester Preservation Board indicated that Coles was the one who initially requested that the church be preserved as a historic landmark. The letter said, quote, "You requested from Ken France of our staff that information be sent to you regarding the status of your application to designate the AME Zion Church as a city landmark and landmark site," end quote. Coles took the lead in the push for preservation and wrote to everyone he possibly could to make sure the church was saved. This is where Coles' efforts, getting out on the street, right, shoe leather on the street, sending letters, talking to people, networking, doing what he was best at, paid off. efforts helped to ultimately preserve the church, and Robert Spellman, in a May 7th, 1971 letter, said to Howard Coles, quote, "In summary, please rest assured, it is our intent to do everything possible to ensure the retention of this structure," end quote. So years of advocacy had paid off. The city of Rochester committed to preserving the church. It was a great first step, but you probably know by now, Howard Coles wasn't done. He wanted to make sure that the church could be renovated and that it would then be turned into something that was not just another building sitting vacant. So he writes to Joe Wilson, Xerox CEO, and says, "I need some money to help with this initiative." He had started the Frederick Douglass Development Corporation to acquire this parcel, 43B, which held the AME Zion Church, and he also wanted to get an office across the street with money from the MLK Foundation. Ultimately, as is the case with people who are trying to do a lot of big things, Coles was not able to successfully revitalize the church in its day. He attempted to get funding from other organizations, but it proved impossible. Coles asked for a lot of things, consistently seeking out funding, and sometimes he got it and sometimes he didn't. But he did preserve this building. The displacement and erasure of black communities was common during the urban renewal era, and the Clarissa Street neighborhood right here in Rochester, as many of you probably know, is a tragic example of this. But Coles's efforts at least allowed one piece of the old black community to stay alive, and that building still stands today. Coles continued his efforts to positively shape the redevelopment of the Third Ward, where this urban renewal was taking place, as part of the Third Ward Urban Renewal Advisory Committee. When the city of Rochester created the Third Ward Preservation District, it was an immediately polarizing move in the community. According to Lou Bettino, quote, "Fight and ABC fought against the creation of a Third Ward Preservation District in what is now known as the Cornhill neighborhood starting in 1972, end quote. However, this Third Ward Urban Renewal Advisory Committee was actually in favor of the proposal to advance urban renewal. This committee provided a statement and said, quote, "Although the committee was divided in its feelings about a preservation district, a majority voted to approve it," end quote. So let me just slow down for a second and say, many people who were a part of this probably felt urban renewal was inevitable, or they felt some gain could be had from pumping more money into this, the Third Ward neighborhood. However, it was a hotly contested issue, and this committee that was put together on which Howard Coles served ultimately did not have consensus, but they did have a majority to advance this work. During the 5 years between 1972 and 1977, as urban renewal was taking place, the demographics of the Cornhill neighborhood in the Third Ward shifted significantly. Lou Bettino writes, quote, "ABC Director James McCullough noted that between 72 and 77, the population of Cornhill dramatically moved from 80% non-white to more than 75% white in a period of 5 years," end quote. Unfortunately for the residents of the Third Ward, it seems their voices were seldom heard during this urban renewal process, despite community organization and efforts to influence the city plans. Coles, of course, continued to use his newspaper to advocate for more low-income housing to be built, and he also allowed the community to voice their concerns through the newspaper. More research on the role played by the Third Ward Urban Renewal Advisory Committee is needed. More research, more generally, on the role of urban renewal in Rochester is needed. I see my colleague Mark Rice has done some work on this. We need to understand more about this process. It fundamentally shaped the city that we live in to this day. According to the minutes of the Third Ward Urban Renewal Advisory Committee, quote, "Mr. Coles stated firmly that the Frederick Douglass Development Corporation has contacted the mayor, Councilman Parinello, Councilman Wood, City Manager Hill, Monroe County Republican Chairman Dwyer, and Urban Renewal Administrator Mr. Spellman, asking to be designated as the developer of 43B," end quote. Coles had not given up his dream to revitalize this historic AME Zion Church building. He was actually, in this case, actively competing against the committee he was on to lead the role in revitalizing this site. That's Coles to a T. He was later denied participation in the subcommittee of this committee that was charged with thinking about the redevelopment of the site. Some people didn't take kindly to his efforts. But the Frederick Douglass Development Corporation was ultimately denied the opportunity to redevelop the site. There is a congregation that is active right now in the AME Zion Church. My understanding is that the church still needs some significant improvements. So, what to make of this public life of Howard Coles? Obviously, Obviously, it was one filled with many battles. And when you fight many battles, you don't win them all. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Coles fought. And in the larger scheme of things, he was an advocate on the right side of history quite often. His efforts did manage to preserve the historic Amy Zion Church building, which still stands to this day as a monument to the courage and strength of those who have struggled for freedom in this great city. Coles' life can be seen as one of struggle. From his earliest days challenging the NAACP to live its charter, to his work bringing awareness to the living conditions of black migrants in the city, to his struggle to bring to light the profound contributions of black Rochesterians, through to his struggle to publish his newspaper for more than 60 years, his struggle to make fight work for all people, his struggle to build and sustain organizations and projects like the Frederick Douglass Nonviolence League, Operation Grassroots, his struggle against the mighty forces of urban renewal in the Third Ward, and his struggle to preserve Amy Zion Church. But this was a beautiful struggle for Coles, because it was a cause to which he devoted his life. And that larger cause was pursuing truth in all things. As he wrote in the first issue of his newspaper in 1933, quote, "In this paper, we place great stress upon the truth, for we believe that only by being straightforward, by being upright in our dealings with the public, can we possibly succeed." End quote. There are perhaps no better words than Cole's own here in describing a life in service to the black community in the greater city of Rochester. Thank you all so much. I'd like Chris to come up and join, and we'd love to have some conversation and some questions. Yes, ma'am. It is, yes. You can find the Voice digital publication on the RMSC site, Rochester Museum and Science Center. Yep. And if you just search the Voice RMSC or Howard Coles, it'll pop right up. Yeah. 1933. 1996. Yeah. So that's the longest running black newspaper in the region. And probably among some of the longest running in the nation. One thing that's interesting about that, of course, is that the newspaper starts before the traditional civil rights era and extends well beyond the traditional civil rights era. So you can see in the cover of the newspaper the way in which issues are changing and shifting, right? What it looks like before you have civil rights advocacy and what it's looking like decades after as well. It's an amazing historic treasure trove. Yes, ma'am. Oh, thank you.
The nonviolent, Frederick Douglass started the nonviolent movement. So where I thought ICB started with Gandhi.
So, Chris, you can step in on this too. I think what Coles was up to in saying that Frederick Douglass founded the Frederick Douglass Nonviolent League in 1889 was that Frederick Douglass laid down the spirit of the Frederick Douglass Nonviolent League. I don't think that was a formal organization that was started by Douglass. And that's really Coles in part trying to carry forward the spirit of Douglass in his whole life.
Interesting, because I always wondered about that because Frederick Douglass went on a tour in England.
Right.
And Gandhi became Catholic.
Yes.
And I always wondered that. So
Yeah.
that's where that spirit of
Yes. So I'm pretty sure Frederick Douglass's tour of Ireland and England was 1849, somewhere in that time period. Okay, yeah. And so Gandhi is going to be starting his career in South Africa in the 1880s. So Gandhi does come after
correct.
Frederick Douglass.
Right.
Yes, ma'am. Yep. And also, I mean, we probably know this, but Frederick Douglass started as a constitutionalist, believing that the U.S. Constitution was an anti-slavery document. But by the time the Civil War came along, he was out here saying, yo, we're going to have to fight. And I'm recruiting black soldiers, and we're going to have to fight and spill blood. So, Frederick Douglass ultimately came to believe the only way slavery was going to end was with great bloodshed.
Wow, this is a fascinating figure. How did you come to discover Mr. Cole? How I'm fascinated by that. These guys, it's the shadows.
I moved here. I'm in my third year here in Rochester. So I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. Great civil rights city. National Civil Rights Museum is there. It's the place where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. So that's the reason I do this work, because I grew up in that place. And so the living legacy of civil rights continues, right? But when I came here to Rochester to teach at Fisher, I always joke that in the summer of 2023, I got my PhD in Rochester history. So I had to figure out, right, what is this place? And teach courses to our students. And it didn't take long going down that rabbit hole to stumble upon Howard Coles. And I want to give a shout out to the library because, here, let me see if I can pull this up for y'all real quick. I showed earlier in the presentation that he published a Black Business Directory. And, oh, you can see it right up here at the top. Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County. And so, yeah, shout out to the library for getting this digitized. And, I mean, I teach this document with my students. So I have them look at this, and he's literally saying, here's how many black barbers we have. Here's how many black carpenters we have. Here's how many black morticians we have. Here's how many black plumbers we have. And he's listing all of these individuals, their occupations. It's literally a sort of directory of black life in Rochester. And when I saw that, I just had to ask, who is this person? I've been doing this a while, and this is a kind of special document. Because you have to think about that. How do you produce something like that? You literally have to get out here and go talk to people. I mean, it's 1940. You're not going to get on Facebook or Google, right? And the yellow pages, the city directory, is going to be of limited utility. So then I'm like, okay, there's something to this person, right? And so I was able to start to learn a little bit more about him. Even in the literature, Laura Warren Hill's book that Chris has referenced a few times called Strike the Hammer, I think he's mentioned, I'm not sure if he's mentioned it all.
No, I don't recall seeing him at any point. So there's a huge gap in the literature that he fits into very well. Really, like you said, he's flown under the radar, but there's more than enough to publish about him or to fit him into the grand scheme of the narrative that Laura Hill's made with Strike the Hammer. And also, I'd like to give a shout out to his daughter, Joan Coles Howard, who did a lot of work helping us get this collection researched and preserved.
I saw he had an office at 16 State Street on one of the pictures. Do you know where he lived? Where his home was?
I think he did. I think they did live on Clarissa Street for most of his life. That's a great question. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So you can see here he's got 446 Clarissa Street. Yeah. And one great project that we should do. My colleague Mark Rice and I do a lot of mapping with our students. And one thing we could do is to actually go back and map out the black community in ArcGIS before urban renewal took place, to really show some of these key sites where Howard Coles' home was, office. Of course, we know about the Pithod Club, which was down there, and a variety of other institutions. But I take my students on a walking tour of that street, Clarissa Street now, and you can basically see almost no indication of what it was. So we have more to do to kind of recreate that environment where Howard Coles was doing his life's work. I'm sorry? Yeah. That is a question I do not know the answer to. Does anybody know? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I think that was the.
Yeah. Yeah. Douglas Fink. Yep, that's right. Was it the Talbot building where he was? Talbot building.
What you're referring to is the Tallman Building, which is actually on West Main Street, but near State. Yeah. Yep. Actually, the Tallman Building, T-A-L-M-A-N. It's still there on. It's on Main Street. It's right on the west end of the bridge. Still there.
I can't imagine that he earned his living publishing the Voice. That would not have sustained him and his family. What, besides all his extracurricular activities, how did he earn his living?
Chris,
Oh, you said he was a realtor, Chris.
yes, he was a realtor. He did at one point. He was circulating a lot of newspapers, so I think that he did actually earn some money. At least in some period of publishing the newspaper, he was earning a lot of money doing it. And then, of course, he also worked as a real estate agent. And to be honest, I think most of his life he was not that wealthy. He was struggling. Yeah, yeah. So he definitely dedicated most of his time to just trying to do as much activism as he can.
No, I mean, if you talk to his daughter Joan Coles Howard, she also says, they were making it work, and his was a life of service. Yeah. At one point, I think it's important to remember he did, I think, starting in the 70s, just start to give the paper away for free. They just weren't making any money, and in the earlier days, you can see a lot more advertisements in the paper, right? But even before the news industry shifted, right, it was a labor of love. She is 85. Yeah, 85 years young. Yep. No, I believe that he also had a son. I know at least one son, and then maybe another sister too. Yeah. Great questions.
I noticed one of his acting, he never mentioned race and policing. I don't know if you ever come up on that. Race and policing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, the question was, in his activism, did he ever talk about issues of race and policing? Race and policing.
Honestly, there was one when I was doing my research for this initially, and I was looking at one of the things I looked at was how polls covered certain news issues compared to like the Democrat and Chronicle and the Times Union. And I remember seeing issues about a woman who was killed by police named Denise Hawkins in the 70s. Yeah, but I could not find anything in Cole's newspaper where he talked about that. And I think maybe the reason was that Cole's really tried to focus on positive stuff a lot of the time. Like his daughter will say that he really didn't like publishing the negative stuff, and he wanted to kind of keep a positive attitude.
But yes, sir.
Because I was thinking more because step into that type of dynamic, people try to intimidate you. They appear at your house, front door, not the front door, park outside your front door, follow you around. So I was curious, like, maybe that's why he just said, "I'm leaving this alone." In terms of like, like you were saying, focus on the larger issue, more positive, like, leave that alone. Because, in terms of safety and security.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that stuff definitely happened in Rochester. I know the Nation of Islam up in Rochester had like a huge police raid and crackdown and things like that. But I think maybe because Coles was a little under the radar, he might have been able to kind of avoid that stuff as well. But that's a good point. I didn't really think about that.
So one of the things Joan Coles Howard mentioned to me is when the rebellion happened in 1964, Howard Coles didn't cover it in the newspaper because he said he only covered real news. And there was a feeling among Coles that, and again, this is again hearing sort of anecdotally from some of his relatives that he didn't agree with what was happening in the streets in 1964. And there were, a number of established middle-class black folks here who would fall into that same category. It was a reasonable, viewpoint to take, and Coles wasn't alone in that. So I don't know how much that contributed to a lack of coverage of the issue. Joan Coles Howard mentioned that the reason they started the Third Ward beat originally in the mid-'60s was because they wanted to cover what was happening. So she, being a young person, said, well, if my dad's not going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so we have some of those earlier. I've got one in my office from that earlier Third Ward beat. But your question is an incredibly good one because he's obviously very critical of the NAACP, and he and his wife, right, in the early 1940s. And the NAACP is consistently, if you go through any NAACP archive in this country, the dominant issue you're going to see in that archive is instances of police intimidation and brutality. That's going to be the number one issue. They're consistently filing complaints in that way. So it's notable, I guess, that through the 50s and 60s, Coles is not really involved with the NAACP because that's going to be a time period where you're going to see routine documentation of these issues. And of course, by 1967, the Kerner Commission concludes the number one reason all of these American cities are burning is because of these incidents with police. That's what tips this off. The federal government studies this issue. They say this is the problem. Of course, Rochester is one of 2,000 cities during this time period. That's a statistic that should shock you if you didn't know that. From 1964 to 1972, 2,000 American cities had these so-called race riots. Elizabeth Hinton, a Yale historian, has written a book called America on Fire and documents this time period. What's notable about Rochester is it was the second city to have such instance take place. The first to take place in Harlem just a week before. And all the Rochester newspapers covered that issue and said nothing like that could ever happen in Rochester. Because we have such great race relations. Right. So your question is a phenomenal one, and that's a really good line of inquiry for us to follow. Because if you look at the Nation of Islam, extremely well organized in Rochester in the 1960s. You all may know this, but one of the incidents that led to the rebellion was a meeting at a Nation of Islam mosque here in 1963 where police entered the prayer service with police dogs. So if you didn't know about that, right, that was one of the things that greatly incensed the community. And the Fruit of Islam, right, the sort of armed wing of the Nation of Islam that was committed to self-defense, right, they respond very strongly to those kinds of issues. So the Nation of Islam was very strong. This was sort of a second home for Malcolm X, who was one of the most, if not the most, critical voices on police brutality during this exact time period. So we know this was a critical issue. And there were a number of other things, I won't just keep going about this, that were direct confrontations with police that led to the 1964 rebellion. But I don't think we found any of that in the archive.
Coles didn't seem to focus on it very much at all.
That's a notable absence, though. So, yes, sir. Thank you, Mark.
Do you see much in the archives about the 7th Ward at all?
Yeah, I feel like the 7th Ward, off the top of my head, I feel like there was a lot of info about the 7th Ward, and I don't know exactly what he all would have compiled on that, but he did a lot for a lot of different wards. Basically, anywhere the black community was, he definitely had a lot of information on it. Okay, yeah, Beta Norman definitely had information on Beta Norman.
Another question? Cool. Yeah. I think they started the first black-owned business in Midtown. Yeah. about like how would you characterize Howard Coles, right? You look at civil rights leaders, we use terms like militant to describe a Malcolm X or nonviolent to describe a Dr. King, and we sort of think in these binary ways. It's really not very helpful because you look at a figure like Coles, he doesn't really fit into any of those categories. And he's a figure who, as you say, was really focused on trying to tell the good news, uplifting, proactive. You saw he was involved in organizing demonstrations and protests, but that wasn't the only thing that he did. And he never shied away from bureaucratic processes, writing letters, talking to people, following rules, completing forms, teaching you how to do all that stuff. Yeah. So he's an interesting leader in that way. He really challenges these archetypes we have of what it means to be a civil rights leader. And so in that way, I think we can learn a lot from him. Thank you for sharing your experience. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Oh, yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and I've taken my classes over there. I would still be taking them, but I think it's temporarily closed. Yeah, not sure why, but yeah. Beautiful thing. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what was the comment you made earlier about the Church of Christ? That they met there or something?
He had planned to use it since the black population was divided on two sides of the river. The Church of Jesus Christ was basically AMB Zion would be a daycare center and like where they would teach people how to read and write and things like that on one side of the city. And then the other side of the city, they would use the Church of Jesus Christ as like their base of operations.
Is that Latter-day Saints?
No,
Latter-day
no,
Saints?
definitely not. I don't think so.
Yeah, we'd have to look into the documentation. It was called the Church of Jesus Christ. There we go.
East Side Church of Jesus Christ. That's what it has listed on the archives. Again, I don't know if this is still an active church because this was in like 1962. So, but it does say that it was called the Church of Jesus Christ, and then the west side was, of course, AMB Zion.
And I'm going to guess that that's not the Church of Christ, which Franklin Florence was affiliated with. But I don't know historically what that church exactly is either. It'd be worth looking into that. Great questions. Other thoughts or questions or comments about Howard Coles? Yes, sir, please.
Where are these papers located?
Sorry, sir?
The repository, where you can find papers.
Oh, the Rochester Museum and Science Center. You got to email them, and basically you have to kind of schedule an appointment to look through the papers they have, but it's all there. You can look through whatever you like. It's a massive amount of information. Yeah.
Yes, the finding aid is online for the Howard Coles papers. Yep, you can pull that up. It's got some good biographical. It's an outstanding finding aid for those of us who care about such things. Yeah, really well organized. And the papers are very well organized too. All right, hearing nothing else, just want to say thank you again for being here today. We can stick around and talk.
Thank you guys.
Appreciate y'all.